you for joining us for another program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I am particularly pleased to host this program, which features one of my favorite authors, a lady I followed through several book signings, and who has now become a personal friend. Dr. Beverley Driver Eddy is the author of 7 books. She is Professor Emerita from Dickinson College, where she taught German language and literature. If any of you are fans of the Gettysburg Times newspaper, you will find that Bev and her husband Truman for 9 years wrote a column on the social history of language in the Gettysburg Times. And you can find those online. You can look at newspapers.com if you're not from here. And I think you will find them very enjoyable. I first met Beverley Eddy because of her book on the Psycho Boys, as she called it, the psychological warfare training camp that was here in Gettysburg during World War II. And the camp is still there. It's still located on the battlefield in Gettysburg. The buildings are gone, but the flagpole remains. And we included that in part of our World War II tours that we did for our World War II leadership training programs. But that's another story. Bev has gone on to study the Ritchie Boys from Camp Ritchie in World War II, and tonight she is bringing us an aspect of the Ritchie Boys story by looking at the 200 WACs who served alongside the Ritchie Boys in World War II. She has the ability to bring out their personal stories, their interests, their frustrations, and has given us a very colorful program this evening. So I hope you will welcome our speaker, Dr. Beverley Driver Eddy.
I'm delighted to be here today. As the audience may know, I wrote a book about Camp Ritchie last year that was published under the title Ritchie Boy Secrets. This is a book about the Military Intelligence Training Center in Maryland, and in it I wrote not only about the trainees in this program, but also about the massive staff of GIs who supported it and the other intelligence programs mounted at the camp. And so I did not like the title my publisher gave my book because I found it too restrictive. The publisher was right, of course, in that the words Ritchie Boy attract readers familiar with the documentary film on the Ritchie Boys and with the popular 60-minute segment on Ritchie Boys. And it certainly has helped book sales. What this title did, however, was ignore certain groups covered in my book, such as the Ritchie Girls, those WACs who came to Camp Ritchie's Military Intelligence Training Center to work in all aspects of the camp, and for some of them to teach and study with men. Before turning to them, though, I would like to clarify that in doing my research for the book, I had quickly learned that there are misperceptions even as to what exactly a Ritchie Boy is. According to the documentary film, the 60-minute segment, and the best-selling book Sons and Soldiers by Bruce Henderson, Ritchie Boys are German and Austrian Jews who fled Hitler, came to the States, became soldiers, and returned to Europe to defeat the Nazis by cunning rather than by weaponry. This story is truly an inspiring one, but it does not cover all the other Ritchie trainees who took the same classes, were members of the same teams, and performed the same services both in Europe and in the South Pacific. And you can see here the variety of soldiers who were sent to Ritchie for intelligence training. The 2 top pictures on the left are German Ritchie Boys. The one at the very top is the actor, Peter Van Eyck. But while German and Austrian soldiers were by far the largest minority group at the camp, nearly 20%, soldiers from many other nationalities gathered there as well. For example, we see right below the Germans an Arab who was a highly effective propagandist for the Americans in the African campaign. And a full 60% of the soldiers were born in America. These men often had immigrant parents or had spent considerable time themselves living in foreign countries. All of them were multilingual. So, at the top right, you see an American who'd grown up in China, and beneath him a Mormon. Mormons were a relatively high percentage of American soldiers at Ritchie, since they had served all over the world as missionaries. In the lower left, we have next to the Arab, a Black American, a Japanese American, a Greek American, and a Native American. And some of these men could tell of their own personal experiences of racial bigotry here in the United States. But today I want to turn away from them and talk about the contributions of an important but small, less visible group of soldiers at the camp, its WACs. And in doing so, I will first describe how the WACs came about. Then I will highlight individual women WACs at Camp Ritchie, describing their backgrounds, their service, and their post-war activities. The Women's Army Corps, or WAC, came into being only after a good deal of resistance. A proposal was already made to Congress to establish a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps back in May 1941, but this proposal was pretty much ignored until after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Then, with the strong support of Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, action was finally taken, and the bill became law in 1942. Roosevelt set its recruitment goal at 25,000, but so many women applied to the service that just 6 months later, the goal was raised to 150,000. The idea behind the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was to free men up for active duty. The Army hoped to draw on already experienced typists, stenographers, and telephone operators, and to have them take over these tasks in the Army. There was a good deal of initial enthusiasm for the program. Patriotism ran high, and many wives, mothers, and widows signed up in support of the men in their family. Others joined in the hope for adventure and the opportunity of possibly being sent abroad. The director of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and later the Women's Army Corps, was Ovida Culp Hobby, and she was especially skilled in handling public misperceptions of what the women's service would entail. Here we see part of one 2-page spread that appeared in the nation's newspapers, depicting a typical day in the life of a WAC. Coincidentally, the woman chosen, Sally Davis, would come to Camp Ritchie, train with the men in order of battle, and be sent to the Pacific to serve at General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. She is a true Ritchie girl in that she trained with the Ritchie Boys by taking courses with them. The first auxiliary contingent sent overseas went in January 1943 to Algiers. This marked the beginning of a massive slander campaign against women serving with Army men. Ironically, this campaign was especially strong among the GIs with whom the WACs were serving, but it easily found resonance among the population at home. Americans at that time held strangely antithetical views towards women's wartime service. They saw little difficulty in regularly placing its Army nurses near the front lines of battle in positions far more difficult and dangerous than any the WACs would be facing. Nursing was, after all, a woman's profession, and so it was allowed. But, so the argument ran, being a soldier was not. Although the Women's Auxiliary Corps was not yet part of the Army, many Americans questioned the motives of any woman desiring to serve overseas. This was, after all, an age when it was still considered provocative for a woman to wear slacks. So naturally, the idea of women playing an active role in the African campaign was repugnant to many. Many GIs fed this bias by suggesting that the WACs had come overseas merely to find a husband. Worse yet, They suggested that many were women of loose morals who were there to break up otherwise solid GI marriages. Letters to the editor and many American newspapers raged that the WACs were either wildly promiscuous or lesbian. The cartoons of the day were less aggressive and merely pictured the WACs as ditzy and vain and incapable of performing their work accurately. Why were the GIs so opposed to women's service? One main reason was that they realized that the women were being sent to replace the GIs assigned to offices in administrative posts and to technical and mechanical duties. This would free up the men to fight in the front lines. As the WAC advertising slogan went, "Release a man for service." And not all GIs were enthusiastic about going to the front lines. But in spite of this campaign, the women proved to be so valuable in their overseas work that they were fully incorporated into the Army as the Women's Army Corps. And in September 1943, the first WAC contingent arrived at Camp Ritchie. The change from Auxiliary Corps to Army Corps was deemed necessary because of inequities in rank and pay between women and men performing the same tasks. Furthermore, as mere auxiliary staffing, women did not have the government's Army support, either in health services, death benefits, or protection if captured by the enemy. The women who had been serving in the auxiliary were now given the choice of joining the new WAC or returning to civilian life. 75% of the women decided to remain. Recruitment was an ongoing problem, however, given the effectiveness of this long slander campaign that had preceded the establishment of the Women's Army Corps. Now, in an effort to combat this, the papers featured celebrity recruits in the hopes that these would draw more women to service. Quite a few Camp Ritchie WACs were part of this marketing campaign. Here we see Gregor Armstrong, a blue blood socialite who not only was pictured in newspapers around the country, but featured in an issue of Vogue magazine in her Army uniform. And to the right, we see Jeer Knight, widow of the author and war hero Eric Knight, and herself a writer and script editor who had overseen story development for the film Gone with the Wind, and had helped edit her husband's novel, Lassie Come Home. She was one of the 300 WACs who worked with SHAEF in Europe, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, where she directed a team of cryptographers and reported directly to General Eisenhower. In assigning WACs to Camp Ritchie, the Army preferred those who were fluent in at least 2 languages. Still, it was a distinct minority of foreign-born women who served in the military. Whereas 40% of the Ritchie Boys were foreign-born, only 10% of the Ritchie WACs were. The main reason for this is that by far the largest group of Ritchie Boys were being trained to interrogate prisoners of war. The WACs would not be handling that intense interactive duty. Their language work consisted mainly of translation, interpretation, and the deciphering of documents. And there was another interesting distinction between the Ritchie WACs and their male counterparts. Over 25% of the WACs stationed at Camp Ritchie were commissioned officers. When the WAC women came to Camp Ritchie in September 1943, they came to barracks and office space built on the far side of the lake from the enlisted men's barracks. Ruth Mills Bradley was the first Camp Ritchie WAC commander. She was anything but the ditzy, vain sexual predator portrayed by those who had slandered the earlier WACs. Born Ruth Mills in 1911, she was orphaned at the age of 7 and adopted by Cyrus Sherwood Bradley, the former employer of her deceased mother. She graduated from high school in Fairfield, Connecticut, then went to work in the Fairfield branch of the Bridgeport Trust Company. She was 30 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and she became the first woman from the state of Connecticut to sign up for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. She completed her 4-week basic training at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, and was featured in the film Women at War, leading her troops for parade and inspection. Bradley was later chosen for Officers Candidate School and became a first lieutenant in June 1943. 3 months later, she was sent to Camp Ritchie to activate its new WAC detachment. She became a captain in August 1944 and was sent to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and Fort Stoneman, California, for intense overseas training until she shipped off to the South Pacific in September 1944 with 900 WACs under her command. She would eventually retire in 1969 as a lieutenant colonel. Why was Bradley so eager to become a WAC? Patriotism certainly played a role, although one can guess that given her background, she was also eager to escape the confines of her hometown job for meaningful work, offering a potential for advancement and the opportunity of travel. Indeed, the Ritchie WACs represented a variety of ages and previous life experiences. Some were recent college graduates. Some were teachers, librarians, office workers, all professions that could be put to good use in the Army. Many were single, some were widowed, some were married to men in military service. Some simply had dead-end jobs that they hoped to escape. And once the Women's Army Corps was fully integrated into the Army's full military benefits, including the GI Bill and its promise of paid higher education, were an added draw. One of the main tasks of the WACs who came to Ritchie was office and administrative work. This often involved work in the publications office, writing, typing, editing, printing, collating, and stapling the many reports and texts that were produced daily at the camp for instructional purposes and for dissemination by the War Department. The Ritchie WACs also took over a great deal of transport, driving materials out into the mountains for the various field activities the men were required to perform as part of their training. This is Sally Davis, once again, whom we saw featured in the newspapers as a typical WAC in training. Some of the WACs were also assigned to the visual demonstration unit at the camp to perform in the instructional skits and playlets that were written for the trainees. And, of course, they got involved in camp entertainments. The skits they performed in served to reinforce concepts taught in the Ritchie classes. Many of the German and French-speaking WACs were involved in the Ritchie Boys interrogation classes. Here, they developed various personality types and kept files on multiple interrogation situations in order to challenge the men in training in how to deal with civilians. It was important that the men learn the challenges of interrogating not only prisoners of war, but civilian men and civilian women. 12 of the Ritchie WACs were Ritchie Girls, by virtue of their taking classes and training along with the men. Most of these Ritchie Girls concentrated on order of battle, that is, the study of German documents for information of both strategic and tactical importance. But 22 of the Ritchie WACs actually served on the faculty, training the Ritchie boys for their foreign missions. Here are just 2, but 2 are enough to show the varied backgrounds of these faculty members. Alice Parrish, originally a farm girl from Iowa, had been a school teacher for 10 years and a Washington, D.C. policewoman for another 10 years before coming to Camp Ritchie. She also had a law degree. She served for 18 months at Camp Ritchie, training the men in counterintelligence. She credited her experience with law enforcement teaching, and working with feeble-minded children as invaluable for her subsequent duties in the Army. This would be especially true in counterintelligence, where one had to ferret out spies and traitors, often by relying on psychology and healthy instinct alone. Eleanor Moffat had a different background, which would not seem to be particularly suitable for the Army, except, perhaps, that she was fluent in French. She was a multi-talented precision dancer and worked for a time as a rockette at the Radio City Music Hall in New York. She then returned to her home in North Carolina and opened up a dance studio in Greenville. Here she offered dance courses to people of all ages, including even a course for pre-kindergartners. She also bred and showed horses. At Camp Ritchie, she taught French interrogation and British military intelligence. She herself took courses in counterintelligence and Japanese, thereby serving both as faculty member and as Ritchie Girl. And, in her spare time, she continued to participate and win trophies in horse shows. Because of their special language abilities, a goodly number of Camp Ritchie WACs were sent abroad, to Europe and to South Asia. One, Erica Call, became a cover girl for Stars and Stripes, and this photo appeared in newspapers throughout America with comments about the clothes hangers hanging on the WAC's back and the helmet balanced on top of the rucksack. Erica was a German. It is not clear when or why she left Germany, but we do know that she became an American citizen in 1941 and that she was working at the time as a beautician in Cleveland. From Ritchie, she was assigned to the Military Intelligence Research Section in London, working with captured German war documents. And at this point, I'd like to point out that of all the WACs who died during the war, most of them died in London as victims of the German rockets fired into the city. Lillian Tombacher served in the European theater as one of the 300 WACs assigned to SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. She was a Polish Jew, born in Balashov, Russia, in 1917. At the age of 20, she emigrated to the United States. At the time of her induction into the WACs, she had the equivalent of 3 years of college under her belt, which she managed to pay for by working as a skilled seamstress. She enlisted in February 1943. 5 months later, she acquired her American citizenship. While she was at Ritchie, Lillian completed the Order of Battle course and became an instructor in 2 specialties, German enemy armies and enemy Order of Battle. In Europe, she served as General Eisenhower's personal Polish interpreter, and she was rewarded for her services with an American Bronze Star and the Polish Cross of Merit. She remained in the military after the war, transferring into the newly formed Women's Air Force in 1949, and then working on the munitions board of the Central Military Procurement Office in Washington, D.C., with the rank of major. Nellie Singer was born in Germany to Austrian parents. Her father disappeared in 1914 when she was 5, probably as a casualty in World War I. At any rate, she and her mother, who had been living in Vienna with her maternal grandfather, left for the States in 1916, and Nellie spent her early school years in Chicago. She seems to have returned to live in Vienna for at least part of her teenage years. In 1938, Nellie married a Pole in Elkton, Maryland, the elopement capital of the East Coast, and took the name Nellie Vine. 5 years later, she was divorced, had gone back to her maiden name, and was working as a secretary. It was then that she enlisted in the WAC. It was doubtless the combination of secretarial skills and fluency in German that got her assigned to Camp Ritchie when she was 36 years old. She first did secretarial work, but after VE Day, she got involved in the production of reports authored by German generals who'd been brought as prisoners to Camp Ritchie. Then, 2 years after her release from Ritchie in 1947, she served in Dachau as translator and interpreter for the war crimes trials of the men who had operated the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, which was universally considered to be the very worst of all the German work camps. I mentioned earlier that the first commander of the Ritchie WACs was Ruth Mills Bradley, and that she was sent to New Guinea and the Philippines with 900 WACs under her command. Hélène Novak was one of the Ritchie WACs who accompanied her. She had resigned from her job teaching high school English in order to join the WAC when it was still just an Army Auxiliary Corps. Hélène was first stationed in Hollandia, in Oro Bay in New Guinea, then in Leyte and Manila in the Philippines. For the landing in Hollandia, she was required to climb down a rope ladder to disembark from the ship to a landing craft while carrying all her gear on her back. Still, she was enchanted. New Guinea looked very wet and clammy, she wrote, but the greens were most interesting with every shade possible. A native thatched roof, but added just the right touch of local color. Although she and her fellow WACs were doing crucial office work well behind the front lines, conditions were primitive. Their military attire represented a major problem. They arrived in New Guinea in winter uniforms and heavy twill coveralls issued while en route. Many of the women serving there developed skin diseases, since the heat and humidity kept the clothing wet from perspiration. But they were required to keep their entire body covered with clothing in order to be safe from the mosquitoes. Saltwater showers and latrines were in the open, and on some days only a helmet full of water was available for drinking and washing. For Hélène, the adventure outweighed the discomfort. As she wrote home, "The whole WAC area is on a nice beach, slightly dirty from driftwood, oil from the port, and seaweed. But it's fun, and I'm feeling swell." Hélène, like all the Ritchie WACs, was offered the opportunity after the war of re-enlisting for service in Europe or in Asia. Hélène elected to serve for 14 months in Tokyo and 3 more in Korea. Harriet Hunter was born and raised in Oklahoma, where she became a cooking instructor. She became so successful that her endorsements were sought for nearly any housekeeping item sold in that part of Oklahoma, from bed sheets to facial cream to kitchen brooms. She married a local boy, Fritz Emerson, and then both signed up for military service. He in the Navy, she in the WAC. She was assigned to Camp Ritchie as mess and supply officer, then went on to Los Alamos to assume command over the WACs attached to the atomic bomb project. As soon as the war was over, she and her husband returned to their hometown, where he became co-owner of a lumber business and she focused on family. Following Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender, the focus at Camp Ritchie immediately switched to wrapping up the war in Japan. Thousands of Japanese war documents were now brought to Camp Ritchie and housed there, while a group of Japanese-American WACs were brought in to help translate them. Ironically, some of these WACs came from the Japanese-American internment camps that held those who had been living on the West Coast. Tammy Chikiyama, however, was unique in that she had voluntarily entered Camp Poston in Arizona in order to work undercover, studying the social effects of internment on the Japanese families that were housed there. Sue Kato lived in Nebraska and in Colorado and she was spared the indignity of removal from her home. I would like to turn now, if I may, to three typical Ritchie WACs who did not get sent on duty to Europe, Asia, or Los Alamos. What I find interesting about them, though, is the fact that, despite their disparate backgrounds and the differences in their Ritchie duties, they formed a close friendship while they were at Ritchie, and Ritchie had an impact on the later lives of all three of them. The three women all came to the camp in January 1944 and remained for over 2 years. They were all the same age, 24. One sunny day, the three young women posed for a series of photos. This is one of them. Meet Phyllis, Ellen, and Pat. Patricia, or Pat Crane, was blessed with intelligence and a quick wit. She grew up in Waterbury, Connecticut, then moved in adolescence to Long Island, where she took a special delight in the ocean, digging clams, studying birds, and swimming. Although she had only 3 years of high school behind her, she worked as a secretary stenographer and then joined the war effort in 1942 by becoming an aviation engineer apprentice at Grumman Aircraft Corps in Farmingdale, New York. There, she performed various jobs in 2-week shifts, while also taking lessons in drafting and blueprint reading. She was, as she later described it, doing Rosie the Riveter work when she decided to join the WAC. Ellen Kaufman, on the other hand, was both German and Jewish. She was born and grew up in Mainz, Germany. Her mother died giving birth to her, and so her maternal grandmother came to live with Ellen and her father until he remarried when Ellen was 4. Ellen became very close to her stepmother, whom she called her second mother. When she was 6, Ellen acquired a sister, whom she deeply loved. But after Hitler came to power, things got worse and worse for German Jews. Ellen and her maternal grandmother were lucky enough to be able to come to the States in November 1937 through an affidavit given by relatives of her birth mother. She was 17. She worked in several communities around New York as an au pair and then as a shop clerk before joining the WAC in the fall of 1943. By then, she had received word that her parents, her young sister, and numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins had been deported. All of them perished. She became a WAC, she said, because I felt I had lots of reasons for fighting the Hitler Germans. Phyllis McClellan was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She loved learning foreign languages and was the only one of the friends to have a college degree when she entered the WAC. She had a degree in journalism from Hunter College and was working on developing a career as a writer and translator. Here, the three women pose on a set of Camp Ritchie trash cans at the corner of Pauline Cushman Avenue and Belle Boyd Street. For Gettysburgians, these street names are of interest, and they were located in the WAC section of Camp Ritchie, bearing the names of famous women spies of the Civil War. The actress, Pauline Cushman, was a master of disguises and became one of the Union's most successful spies, while Belle Boyd was a messenger and spy for the Confederate Army. But moving to Camp Ritchie days, Pat Crane, Ellen Kaufman, and Phyllis McClellan had a variety of duties at the camp, but each stood out because of her specialty. Pat worked primarily in public relations, assembling news materials and stories of local interest and writing them up for a weekly military publication. Part of this work involved her interviewing military personnel for human interest stories, and these made up a regular special feature of the weekly magazine. Meanwhile, the camp took advantage of Ellen Kaufman's German background and used her for specialized training in interrogation. She not only helped develop training materials for the instructors, she participated in training sessions herself, taking on the role of a telephone operator in the German army with some 1,500 names and telephone numbers in her head. She was remembered by one of the Ritchie trainees as a reenactor who could burst into tears if anyone addressed her harshly, and who, if one treated her kindly, began talking nonstop about anything and everything she was asked. Phyllis was assigned to interpretation and translation of non-Germanic languages while serving as an instructor in British military intelligence. She also studied Japanese and registered for the Foreign Service Officer exam. After Germany's surrender, she joined Ellen in working for the Pacific documents that were housed at Ritchie, and the two friends helped out with the preparation of these documents for publication and dissemination. The three friends all fell in love during their period of service at the camp. Pat even got pregnant. It was not against Army regulations to get married, but getting pregnant was. This put the Army in a bind. Under a government directive, no Army woman could be discharged for a reason not equally applicable to an Army man. To resolve this issue, Pat's pregnancy was declared a medical problem. The Army declared Pat a disabled veteran, and she left Army service with an honorable discharge. She did not marry the child's father. Ellen followed a different path. While doing interrogation work at Ritchie, she met Melvin Boucher, a Ritchie boy who was 6 years younger than she. He worked with her in the interrogation section. He also trained in French interrogation, counterintelligence, and photo interpretation. Melville's family met and approved of his engagement to Ellen, although they insisted he wait until he turned 20 before getting married. Because Ellen's American relatives objected to her marrying a non-Jew, the couple decided to have a small private wedding in the Ritchie chapel. Melville was already stationed in Brazil when he turned 20, and he had to return to the States on a flight available basis in order for the marriage to take place. Pat had already left the camp by then, but Phyllis served as one of their two witnesses. Phyllis also met and fell in love with a Ritchie boy, with Norman Kahn, who was 9 years older than she and a native of Belarus. Norman had already entered Camp Ritchie in February 1943 as a member of the 5th class, but he had remained at the camp as an instructor in Russian. It may have been Phyllis's interest in languages that helped nurture the relationship. At any rate, they married in the spring of 1947 after Phyllis had completed a master's degree in education at Hofstra University. Pat had hoped to keep her baby daughter, but found it impossible to manage that as a single mother. She gave the child up for adoption, then took advantage of the GI Bill to study at Hofstra University. There she got her BA in English and met her husband-to-be, John Leal, in a political science class. The two fell in love, in part, over a shared love of poetry. While John earned his graduate degree at Yale, she enrolled in coursework in English there as well. In 1954, John got a job teaching sociology at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and she spent the remainder of her life there, getting involved in democratic politics and working as a pollster. Always a lover of nature, she collected pets, flowers, and hazelnuts, and returned to Long Island every summer with her children to refresh herself at the ocean of her childhood. She had 5 children, 1 boy and 4 girls, but never forgot the daughter she had had to give up for adoption in 1946. She was unsuccessful in all her attempts to track her down. But years after her death at age 80, her daughters found their older half-sister through Ancestry.com. When the siblings reunited in 2017, Pat's oldest daughter was 71. Elvin and Melville spent the first year of their marriage in Brazil, where he was serving with the joint Brazil-U.S. Ministry Commission. Melville's father was consul general at the American consulate, so that gave the young couple a family environment in Rio de Janeiro. Then, in April 1947, Melville was discharged, and the couple moved to Washington so that he could earn his college degree at Georgetown University. Ellen went to work in a fancy department store to help with finances. After a year, she too took advantage of the GI Bill to get a secretarial degree, then landed a job at the Brazilian Aeronautical Commission, where Melville was then working. He soon got a job at the U.S. Department of Labor and later moved to the National Security Agency for the rest of his career. In 1955, Melville was offered a job working for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in Paris. By now, Ellen had 2 small boys. When the family's flight to Paris was rerouted to Frankfurt, Ellen passed by train through her old hometown of Mainz. It was, she said, too soon after the Holocaust, and she still hated everything to do with Germany. I didn't mind at all seeing that much of the city had been bombed and destroyed during World War II, she said. I felt it served them right for having supported Hitler. She very much enjoyed their time in Paris, however, and it was here where she gave birth to her 3rd child, a daughter. Melville was again posted to Paris in 1966, but was transferred to Stuttgart, Germany, after just a year. This was extremely difficult for Helen, since she still could not bring herself to socialize with Germans. Fortunately, she acquired a wide circle of American friends there. After Melville's second tour, they returned to the States and their home in Maryland. And once their 3 children were teenagers, Ellen returned to work as a medical secretary and worked in this field for many years. She and Melville traveled all over the world, including to China, New Zealand, and Central America. When he retired, they relocated to Canandaigua, New York, then to Minnesota to be closer to their daughter. Melville died of Alzheimer's in 2002. Ellen lived another 12 years and died just 3 days shy of her 94th birthday. Phyllis and Norman also had 3 children, also 2 boys and 1 girl. Around 1955-56, Norman got into the shipping business with his 2 brothers and a partner. One of these ships was registered in Panama, and the family moved to Panama to manage it. But the marriage was an unfortunate one. A nephew said that, quote, one could hardly imagine a couple more mismatched, and the children suffered as a result. Norman was a wild, undisciplined man. Phyllis was calm and appeared to be uninterested in motherhood. But her granddaughter speculates that, although her demeanor may have changed after her marriage, Phyllis remained, quote, an incredibly curious, busy, and determined person throughout her life. Shortly after their return from Panama, Phyllis and Norman got divorced, and Phyllis embarked on a new life, and her intellect and biting wit came to the fore again. She was always a lover of dogs and was an active member of the Weimaraner Club of America for many years. She became a licensed pilot, equestrian, and diver. She also won acclaim as a respected writer of science fiction. Later in life, she settled in South Carolina and appeared in several Shakespearean productions put on at the annual Spoleto Festival in Charleston. She also appeared in several small production films and as an extra in the 1983 film The Big Chill. She died in 2012 at the age of 91. Phyllis, Ellen, and Pat, three friends who lost track of one another after the war as each went her separate way. This is typical of many women who served together during the war, and in the case of these three friends, it was probably inevitable since all three married, had children, and got on with their own lives in different states. And Ellen's and Phyllis's travels would have made it difficult in any case to keep in touch. But I was pleased to learn that the children and grandchildren of all three still have these photographic testimonials to the women's Camp Ritchie friendship. Obviously, the three women had treasured their Camp Ritchie experiences. By the time the war ended, it was clear to the War Department that the WACs had performed vital services that surpassed even the Army's expectations. Still, after the Japanese surrender, all WAC training centers closed, and no further WAC training was conducted. Then, in February 1946, the War Department began offering those WACs still in service and those who had finished their wartime service the choice of re-enlisting for service in Germany and Japan. Obviously, WACs were still needed. About 20% of these WACs did, but most opted out in order to start families and build their own careers. By the end of May 1948, there were only about 6,500 WACs still on active duty. Part of the problem was that the legislation that had given the WACs full service status during the war was set to expire in 1948. From 1946 to 1948, Congress hotly debated the question of its renewal. Representative Margaret Chase Smith of Maine put the matter before the House most succinctly, saying, quote, "The issue is simple. Either the armed services have a permanent need of women officers and enlisted women, or they do not. If they do, then women must be given permanent status." Congress was eventually persuaded and passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948. Its purpose was, quote, "to establish the Women's Army Corps in the regular Army, to authorize the enlistment and appointment of women in the regular Air Force, regular Navy and Marine Corps, and in the reserve component of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps." President Harry Truman signed the bill into law on June 12, 1948. As this photo indicates, women were certainly a growing part of America's armed forces, with Camp Ritchie's Ruth Thomas representing the Women's Army Corps at the signing. During the war, 350,000 women had joined and had served in the Army as Corps members and as Army nurses, as well as in the Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps Reserves. And in 1949, the Women's Air Force was added as a new branch of women's service. Many of the WACs still in active duty transferred from the Army Corps into the Women's Air Force, including former Ritchie WACs. It would not be until October 1978 that WAC training centers would close once again throughout the country. This time, though, the closure meant advancement, since the WAC was now no longer to be considered a separate Army entity. Instead, women were now incorporated into a fully integrated United States Army. But I believe that the achievements of the women in the old Women's Army Corps should not be forgotten, despite their absence from the active war zones of World War II. There may have been only 200 WACs who served at Camp Ritchie, but their innumerable war assignments in the United States, in England, Europe, and in the South Pacific contributed significantly to the Allied victories over Germany and Japan. I admire the achievements of the Ritchie Boys, but I ask that we also celebrate the Ritchie women, all of them Army volunteers, who brought their varied talents to the camp as teachers, students, staff, and administrators. They are all an important aspect of the Camp Ritchie story.
Where did you get the wonderful photographs and the stories and the details of their lives? How did you collect this information?
Well, actually, my chief source was newspapers.com. I would type in the names. I went through all 200 WACs and typed in their names and dates, approximate dates. Took a while, but I fortunately there's another source on the web called Fold.3.
Yes.
And I got their papers, and so I knew their birth dates, and that helped a lot because there's lots of Sally Davises in this country that lived in the 40s, and by knowing her birth date, I could sort of narrow it down. Although you'd be amazed how many other Sally Davises were born in 1919 too. Yeah. But I would go through that, and I found quite a few newspaper pictures actually of these people that I could use, and then I could start piecing things together. I could take different newspaper things and say, oh my, this person, was a great cook and a great chef, and what was she doing as a WAC? Especially when I found out, that's how I found out that she went to Los Alamos and was in charge of all the WACs there at the atomic bomb program. I would never have known that if I hadn't gone through newspaper.com. So,
were you able to get in touch with families?
I did with some. The three women, Pat, Phyllis, and Anita, I got in touch with all their families. And the exciting thing there was they all had the same pictures. And I thought, oh, this is something. The three women must have treasured that friendship, or they wouldn't have kept these pictures and passed them on to children and grandchildren.
How many of the Ritchie boys and girls did you personally get to talk to?
I only talked to the one Ritchie girl. I couldn't find any other who was alive. I found one that had been living in New York and had been turning up at all these reunions and going to the VFW hall, and yet I couldn't find her. Whitepages.com. She wasn't there. I couldn't track her down, and I couldn't find her. So no, none other ones were alive.
The Ritchie Boys?
Ritchie Boys. I'd already talked to the 10 Ritchie Boys that had been sent to Camp Sharp. I had, I'd say about 40 books of memoirs and things of other Ritchie Boys. So I didn't talk to that many. I talked to about 6 new ones. And I talked to ones where I saw that they did something that was kind of unique in the war, or they talked about an aspect of the war that I didn't know about. And I wanted to get detail on that.
I remember from your Camp Sharp book that you visited Germany, where some of the Camp Sharp veterans were living.
Well, actually, yes, because I was working in Germany at the time, doing my research into Klaus and Erika Mann. And so I was based in Munich. And so one of the Ritchie boys lived in Zurich, not that far away. And so I got in touch with him over there. Yeah.
God, what a wonderful collection of stories. Thank you for saving them and for sharing them with us.
Well, thank you.